and you become aligned with the isness of things. Thereby the ego diminishes. Now, most people only begin doing that when they realize that they've been unhappy for too long. The greater part of their unhappiness arose through the mental narrative about the situations they encounter in their lives. The I that most people then refer to, this word refers to, is what I call the surface self that is made up of your personal history, of course, all the things that you have experienced and all the things that from your past that you identify with, things that you have done, things that were done to you, things you have achieved, things you have experienced, the entire culture in which you grew up, the collective culture in your particular country, the the background of your family, how they behaved. All those things together leave traces, and all these, after a while, it begins at an early age, of course. It begins already when the first time you utter the word I, when you are whatever, 2 years old, or as you probably know, very young children, when they first learn to speak, they often refer to themselves in the third person. And they might say, John wants a drink, John, but who is John? I. Oh, that's interesting. After a while, they switch from the third person to the first person, and they utter the word I, and that becomes the most fascinating word for them. And gradually, things accumulate around this I, which at first is just a sound, I. And then, over the years, things accumulate around that sound, but of course it's not just a sound, but it's also a thought. It's a concept in your head. It's a thought. It's a primordial thought, the thought form of I. So it's not just a sound, it's a thought. And around that thought, gradually, things accumulate. It's like things stick to it. It attracts things. So with a child, it starts with toys. There are certain toys, but this toy is not, the child very quickly learns, this toy is not just any toy, it's mine. I have a relationship with this toy, it belongs to me, it's my toy. And that is how very often the child, well, not very often, always, the child experiences for the first time the suffering that arises through egoic identification. Just remove that toy from here to there, or maybe just touch it, and the child goes, that deep suffering. Oh my God, my toy. And then, of course, you put it back, and then immediately goes, oh. And then another child comes, and again the same thing happens. And you can see how enormous suffering arises, not because this toy has been removed from the child or moved from this point to that point by somebody. That would be a very neutral event, but because something has happened in the mind of that child. The concept of I has attracted to itself this thing, which is another thought ultimately, because the toy is out there, but in my mind, the toy is a concept. This my toy. And that concept sticks to the primordial original concept of I, which is the surface I of who I think I am, the I. So, and then for the first time, the child experiences what 2,500 years ago the Buddha described as suffering. And the Buddha said, wherever you go, whatever you do, whatever situation you are in, you will encounter dukkha, which in the Pali language translated is suffering, because the I that you think you are identifies with things that are unstable, that cannot last, and things that do not have the capacity to make you happy or to fulfill you or to tell you who you are. And so for the first time, the child at this early age experiences the truth of the utterings of the Buddha without knowing it, of course, and the suffering that arises when you identify with something. So when your feeling of identity becomes associated with things and concepts. And then, of course, you graduate from it's not just a toy, that was only the beginning. And, of course, then the person grows up and identification comes with many other things. Your parents, what your parents have or don't have, all more and more concepts accumulate around the I, what you are taught by the surrounding culture that you live in, who you are. The culture may tell you who you are. You belong to this particular culture. If you grow up in Australia, whatever sticks to the I will be very different from the collective culture, from what would stick to your concept of I if you grew up in Saudi Arabia. It would be very different, a very different I, and yet the basic mechanism behind it would be the same. The central concept I identifies with certain things, and then your sense of who you are gradually develops, and it consists of things that ultimately you are not, but you don't know that. So you identify with the collective, you identify, in some countries you still identify very strongly with not only your family, but the history of your family, which are all mental concepts, what your grandparents did and what their parents did. And in some cases you need that. People from some cultures who come to the West are surprised that many Western people know very little about their ancestors. And in other cultures you have a very strong awareness of your ancestors. And again, that looks like a nice thing. On one hand, you could say, oh, it's nice, but unfortunately, these ancestors that you identify with, either in a positive or negative way, positive, hopefully positive, they have achieved this or that, or they were the victims of those other people 300 years ago, and then that becomes part of your collective victim identity that you're already taught when you're 6 years old, that 300 years ago these things happened to your people, inflicted by those people. And of course, all those concepts accumulate around the central concept of I. And without knowing it, you become more and more trapped in a prison-like identity, and finally you reach adulthood, and then you have an I that feels semi-complete, but by no means complete, because it is still looking out continuously for things to enhance its sense of self, its sense of identity, or who you are. Because your personal history, yes, it has done a lot to give you your sense of identity, but it's not enough. It feels unfulfilled, the sense of I. It feels not enough, and it feels not clearly defined yet. So in order to be more clearly defined, in some cases you might say, what I need is achievement, and there's nothing wrong with achievement, but in the service of I, achievement is something different. I need certain possessions to tell me who I am. I need that, and once I have that, then I'll be okay. And then you spend a few years, 10, 20, 30, striving after accumulating this or that, or recognition of other people. They need to recognize that I am the greatest. Or people need to recognize that nobody has been more victimized than me. I have been so victimized by life that I'm superior in my victimhood to most people. So the I doesn't mind whether you have. When people talk about ego, people usually think that these are people who have a strong ego, who think they are better than everybody. I'm the greatest. I'm the master of the universe. I work on Wall Street, and I manipulate things behind the scenes. And so you feel great until your bank collapses or whatever. And then you have big suffering, but let's put that aside for a moment. So you identify with that very strongly, and so this is usually what people associate with when they say he has a big ego or she has a big ego. Or if you're not on Wall Street, maybe you have a wonderful body. I saw a man walking in the street this morning. He had taken off his shirt. It wasn't that warm, but he was. He was the only one who walked around the streets by the harbor without a shirt. But of course, I immediately realized why he had taken off his shirt, because he had the most fantastic physique, just masculine. Everybody looked at him, and some people tried not to look. Maybe he's even here tonight. In which case, I congratulate you on your fantastic physique. And why not enjoy that, but realize that it's being used in the service of this surface identity. It becomes a mental concept that makes you feel superior to most others. And if you say, my body is superior to most others, then, well, it probably is for a while. And then, of course, a time will come when it no longer is superior. Just wait a little as the years pass. And then one day you look in the mirror and you realize that something has happened to the mirror and it's not good. But in the meantime, of course, you can be okay for a while, and the suffering comes later. The suffering is always just around the corner when you identify with things, concepts, things, because even that body is not really, it's not the body that makes up the ego, it is the mental concept of my body, of identification with that, then it becomes ego. You can enjoy your body if it's strong, and I never had that. My body was never strong and great looking, so my ego didn't go that way. My ego said, no, leave the body alone, because this is for people who are not highly developed. So my ego said, but I have intelligence and knowledge. I've read more books than these people. They probably never read a single book in their lives. And so, but I had more and more, I attempted to accumulate knowledge through reading, and then I could feel and sound temporarily superior when I met people with wonderful bodies, and I could say clever things and make them feel inferior. So it was a struggle. Sometimes it worked, but it always meant there's an underlying feeling of unease. Am I real? I'm a superior or not? And other people, I lived in England for many years when I was young. There, of course, you still have identification with your social background, less these days than it used to be, but the way it used to be in England, to some extent, perhaps still is, the moment you opened your mouth and uttered a word in English in England, people would immediately know what social class you belong to. Weird. And so people consciously emphasized their accent, upper class accent, and even the way you pronounce the word no would betray your social background, or you were so good at imitating, and many people did that you sounded upper class just by saying, you don't say no, you say no. know. And you could talk about your ancestors and their country mansion and whatever. Okay, that's great. The I feel superior. I couldn't do that either because I didn't know. I'd know my grandparents, but nothing beyond that. So can't have been a very big story to identify with. So all incredible, all these things. Now, as you know, the collective I in some cultures is much stronger than the personalized I. In the Western world, it tends to be a bit more personalized for men, not for everybody, but in some countries you have very strong collective, and often might have to do with your religion, and of course that was also the case in the West until not that long ago. So, and then you have a sense again of superiority. That's one of the key things to understand about the surface I is a feeling of superiority. It looks for that, it needs that. It looks, and it always finds it. And even if you have nothing, if you can't think of anything, any way in which you are superior to anybody else, neither physically, nor mentally, nor in possessions, nor in ancestry, what do you do then? You become a victim. And you can, in your mind, what clings to the I is you as either the personal victim or the collective victim. And this is becoming very fashionable these days, collective victimhood. Not to deny that, of course, things have been done to certain groups of people in the past. Things also have been done to individuals in the past that were very bad. But to use that history, that collective history or personal history, in the service of an identity, that is a delusion. And it is unconscious. And people don't know that this is what they are doing, because everybody is seeking for a stronger sense of identity. So if they can't find it in a positive way, they will happily have a negative identity as the greatest victims. So this is the collective identity thing. Identity is very fashionable these days, and it's unfortunately an illusion, because that is not. You get trapped in your surface identity. Enemies, it loves the surface identity. If it can't feel superior in any other way, it loves its enemies. We are surrounded by enemies. You can do it personally, regard other people as wanting something from you or out to get you, or the whole collective does it. In some ways, certain nations do it. Entire nations cannot survive without the collective concept of our enemies. For example, National Socialism was that in Germany, communism was that, especially in Soviet Russia, and nowadays we still have North Korea. North Korea can only be held together by this collective victim identity of we are surrounded by enemies. And that keeps the collective ego going. Oh, we feel so, our identity is now so clearly defined because we are surrounded by enemies. Isn't that wonderful? They're all out to kill us. Now we know who we are. And let's kill them first so they don't kill us. You can see how it is a delusional identity. So that is, everybody walks with that sense of self, and it makes your life difficult. It creates an enormous amount of unnecessary conflict. When I talk about enemies, just one more thing, almost everybody, the way in which there's one little function that one could call also creating enemies, I call that complaining. Complaining is when you can do it either in your mind or out loud. It doesn't matter, it works both ways. You can complain in your mind about where you are, something is not right about the situation, who you're with, what you are doing but don't want to be doing, but you're doing it, but it's terrible. Or you can complain about something that should have happened, but didn't happen, or something that should not have happened, but it happened. and you can complain about how people behave. When you talk about how people behave towards you, for example, you have an enormous, inexhaustible source of complaints because people tend to be difficult and not do things that they're supposed to do. So you have an enormous source of complaints, and every complaint in your mind, you know what he did? You tell the story of what he did or didn't do, or you all know people, wherever they go into a hotel, they're looking for something to complain about. And of course, invariably, they find something. If you're looking for something to complain about, you'll find something. You can come here too to this talk, and if you are deeply trapped in the complaining pattern, you're already in your mind complaining about what is this guy saying. I shouldn't have come here. I knew I shouldn't have. Why did I listen to him? I always do that. Why do I complain? If you can catch yourself, and this is an egoic device, which is really you making either a person or a situation or a location or an activity that you complain about mentally, you're basically making it into an enemy. And therefore, it strengthens the illusory identity of the ego. So I recommend that as your spiritual practice, you catch yourself mentally whenever you have a complaining thought in your head. And when I say complaining, I'm not talking about something you can actually do something about. Obviously, if you move into a hotel, you get into your room and the bed the sheets have obviously not been changed, and it's dirty, the bathroom is dirty. I'm not telling you to be so spiritual that now you sit there and say, I'm not complaining. I'm going to sleep in this dirty bed and feel really spiritual. No. By complaining, I mean the useless complaining that is not designed to and cannot change anything in the situation. So there, of course, you have an example of something you can take action. You can go down to the reception and you can say, the sheets have not been changed and the bathroom is dirty. Could you please do something about it? And again, there are two ways of doing that and saying that. One is in the service of making wrong, which is the ego way. So then you talk to the receptionist, or it's probably not the receptionist's fault, but you're making the receptionist wrong. How dare you put me in this room with a dirty bed? The ego loves that, and then the receptionist becomes your enemy. And in making the receptionist your enemy, you feel stronger in your identity. And then you look for something, maybe I can complain about something else. Just wait until they serve you the soup or the food at dinner. It's not hot enough. But you can also go to the receptionist and say, without any kind of undertone of making wrong, in a way that is free of ego, you can say, oh, I got to my room and I discovered that the sheets have not been changed and the bathroom is still dirty. Can you please do something about it? No ego. So the situation is there, not used in the service of the ego, not used to strengthen the illusory identity of ego. Therefore, in this situation, the second option I just gave you is not satisfying to the ego. It does not feed it. And this is why many egos don't like doing it that way. So complaint is something very, very common in many people, even people who are already awakening to the spiritual dimension, to the deeper I. They're still trapped in this complaining pattern in their minds. You can, of course, it's easier to catch others, your friends or relatives, when they complain. And of course, I recommend, unless you have a prior agreement with your friends or relatives or family members, to remind the other when the ego surfaces. I don't recommend that you tell people, you're complaining again. because then you come into conflict with their ego, and you cannot fight another ego without being dragged into a useless conflict, which probably will bring up your own ego. Complaining. There's a story about the Zen master who had several disciples, and one disciple came to him and said, "I've been studying with you for 5 years and I still not quite get it. Therefore, I'm going to leave you and travel for a year. Can you give me some spiritual practice for that year?" And the master said, "Yes, I'll give you a spiritual practice." "Okay, thanks. Here it is. So in your travels, wherever you go, whatever situation you find yourself in, whatever you are doing or whoever you are with, just repeat these words: 'Thanks for everything, I have no complaint whatsoever.' And then you'll become enlightened." "Oh, that's cool, thank you." So after a year he came back to the master, and the master said, "Well, how did your spiritual practice go?" And the disciple said, "Well, I did what you said. Thanks for everything, I have no complaint whatsoever. I said it all the time, and I'm still not enlightened. Why did you give me that practice?" And the master said, "Thanks for everything, I have no complaint whatsoever." And at that moment, the disciple became awakened. So before he had repeated the words, but there was not the underlying consciousness behind the words. And when the master did not complain that the disciple didn't get it, that was fine too. So alignment with the present moment is already the beginning of the end of ego. Non-alignment with the present moment strengthens the ego. And that is why the ego, most of the time, tries to get away from the present moment. So that is actually if you really practice that little practice recommended by the Zen master, thanks for everything. There are two aspects to this practice. Thanks for everything, I have no complaint whatsoever. Thanks for everything, of course, refers to gratitude. I have no complaint whatsoever is the absence of the mind arguing with what is. And by arguing almost constantly with what is, continuously strengthening an illusory sense of identity that needs superiority. How do you become superior when you complain about something? Well, when you complain about a person, you obviously feel superior in some way, morally, whatever way, to that person. When you complain about a place, you feel superior to that place because you're pronouncing judgment. You are the judge. Even when you complain about an activity that you're doing, you become the judge, and this is bad. So you can see how the illusion arises. So we have, on the one hand, gratitude and on the other hand, the absence of interference, mental interference with reality. Where's reality? In the present moment. And again, it does not mean you're condemned to non-activity. It does not mean you're like, remember the person whose bed has not been made in the hotel. You can take action, but it is a different kind of action. And you become aligned with the isness of things. And thereby the ego diminishes. Now, most people only begin to do that when they realize that they've been unhappy for too long. And at some point, they realize that the greater part of their unhappiness, and this is an enormous realization, the greater part of their unhappiness arose not through the situations they encountered in their lives, but through the mental narrative about the situations they encounter in their lives. So it's not what is in most. In 95% of cases when unhappiness in whatever form arises in you, unhappiness is a generic term. It could be slightest irritation is already a form of unhappiness. I don't want to be here. They shouldn't do that. They shouldn't. Why did they do that? Already arising of unhappiness. Then more unhappiness can come because you can have an entire sense of narrative in your mind, an identity that sticks around the eye, and that's this my unhappy life. My unhappy life. And many people are trapped in a mental narrative that is the foundation for their illusory sense of identity, and they call that my problematic and unhappy life. Oh, what can I do about this? So all these things that happened shouldn't have happened, but did happen, were not meant to happen, but happened. I never expected these things to go wrong, so badly wrong. Life has treated me so unfairly. What these people did to me and what God did to me. I've had enough of God. There is no God. How could it be? All long stories. How unhappy my life. Now millions of people they are unhappy. They have an unhappy life because of the narrative in their minds. Even if you were in a more extreme situation. Now you might think, well, you're talking about Westerners who are relatively well off. Even if you were let's say, if you were a refugee, now these days there are many refugees moving from place to place, and you would say, is this person not justified in being unhappy? No. I was happy, I was lucky enough to have experienced a period in my life when I had no place to live. I was a kind of refugee, and already I had stepped out of unhappiness, so I could verify in my own life that if I had been unhappy in the situation of sitting on a park bench with virtually no money in my pocket and not knowing what to live on the next day, that would be regarded by many people as justification for unhappiness. But it's not. This is how certain limit situations in your life, things that go badly wrong, not just waiting in the supermarket and starting to get unhappy about how slow they are. That's one form of unhappiness, or a minor form of unhappiness. But that accumulates too over the years. If you're every other time you're in the supermarket, you get irritated and unhappy. It accumulates more, and then in other places every traffic jam you get worked up mentally. Why mistakes? They shouldn't be. How dreadful is this? So in extreme situations, often it is in extreme situations, and I know that quite a few of you have been there. You have been there. You have encountered either something happening to your body, you encountered some great loss in your life, either to do with relationships or work situation or home situation or finances or people close to you, people dying, you have been there, you have experienced a collapse of certain structures in your life. And the reason why you are here is that this collapse in the certain structures in your life has created an opening in the egoic shell, because you suddenly became so unhappy that you woke up. So the suffering that the ego generates is also potentially an opening into realization of, first of all, of who you ultimately are not. Many people have to lose a lot before they realize who they are. So this can be a great blessing to lose your foothold, either because the body becomes ill, or you lose somebody close to you who dies or leaves you, or people close to you suffer enormously, or you lose your home or your work or all your money, possessions, or your reputation, all these things are potentially, first of all, things that are enormously painful for the ego that has built an identity around these things, but potentially they are an opening into who you are beyond the ego. But the good news is, yes, many of you, or quite a few of you, are here because you have already experienced that, and some of you may even be in the middle of experiencing a very difficult life situation. It is not unusual for people to experience a very difficult life situation. It is not unusual at all. So the ego might tell you that you have been singled out for this type of suffering, but that's not the case. There is suffering all around you, and sooner or later, in one form or another, it will come to everybody. So, but the wonderful thing is, it has worked to the extent to which it has created in you an opening, so you are no longer completely trapped in the ego, because something has broken off the egoic structure. A big chunk of ego, of this mental structure, has broken off. And that at first is painful. The breaking off of a big chunk of ego is painful, but it allows an opening. There are the lines, I believe it was Leonard Cohen who wrote, "There's a crack in everything. There's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in." So there is, when something cracks in your life, it is potentially an opening into the deep I. Because what cracks is the surface I that had identified with this, that, or the other. But the wonderful thing is, now you have reached a point where you no longer need to be hit over the head by life to crack your ego. That's probably happened already. And if you haven't suffered deeply, maybe it happened in a past lifetime. If you're 20, 25 years old and things have been fine in your life, and yet you're here, there must be a deeper reason why you're here. So the good news is it worked. It has brought you here, and I don't mean here this particular occasion or with me. It has brought you to a certain state of consciousness that is deeper than the usual state. The deepening has started to happen. Now, this deepening for many humans is first brought about by suffering, but then a point comes when you can actually choose the deepening. So you don't have to wait for things to go drastically wrong in your life before you awaken to the deeper, which we could call the spiritual dimension of life, before you deepen. And for most of you that applies. You don't need to be hit over the head by life anymore and to be inflicted with dreadful suffering. I'm not saying challenges will not come to you. They come all the time. We'll come to that in a minute. But already what we are learning here, and now we come to the more essential part, because so far I've really been talking about the bad news, which is the ego. But it's important to understand the mechanism behind the ego. If you don't understand how the ego works and the favorite ways of the ego to reinforce itself and strengthen itself, then if you don't understand it, then you cannot recognize it when it happens. For example, if you didn't understand how the ego loves complaining, you could be trapped in a complaining mindset for the next 30 years. Why am I not enlightened yet? Well, I've been trying all that kind of stuff. Well, why is it not happening? These people seem to be enlightened. They're smiling. I'm not. Why doesn't it happen? Why is it, etc. But now you recognize it. And now you can actually choose to be present rather than to be trapped in a mental thought form that is ego. Now, ego consists predominantly of thought. So when your identity is egoic, you are deriving your sense of self from the movement of thought. And you, not only that, you are identified with certain thoughts, which means you derive your sense of self from thoughts. All the things that I've mentioned, you believe in thoughts that arise in your mind, and there is an identity in the arising thoughts. My car, my suffering, and everything that comes in, you don't regard. It's not just a thought. That's how it is. My life is awful. Why is it? Why this situation is awful? I just can't stand it anymore. Why are these people? That's how it is. You look out in the morning, you open the curtains, and it's, let's say, well, not here. The weather is quite good, but in other places, it rains a lot. So if you live in London or in Vancouver or in Seattle, often you open the curtains in the morning, and then there's a difference between looking out and saying, oh, fuck, not another grey, miserable day. What am I doing here and stuck in this hole? That's called suffering. Now, there is another way of getting up and opening the curtains and looking out. And you open the curtains and looking out, and you see there's water dripping down from the sky and on the window pane. And there's not a single thought in your head. Not even the thought, oh, the rain is good for the trees and the grass. No. Just you look and you see, there's an aliveness there, but you don't have to tell yourself that. There's light filtering through the clouds. Of course, there must be light. It comes from the sun, but you don't have to tell yourself that. You just see it. You open the curtains and you look and and there's a moment of wonder and a moment almost of, yes, gratitude. Remember, thanks for everything. I have no complaint whatsoever, the spiritual practice. Of course, you don't even need to say that. You can actually experience a situation without the baggage of a complaining or negative commentary. The same situation that before made you unhappy, because it became your entire life, suddenly it's neutral. And it's not only neutral, it's actually alive. This moment is alive. The rain is aliveness. But you don't have to tell yourself that, you just see it. And so I gave just one example of how something changes when you do not impose the baggage, mental egoic baggage of a narrative on the situation. And then you see the rain is completely neutral. It's fine. But you don't even have to tell yourself that. It just is. And you become aligned with the isness of things. It doesn't mean that you cannot move to Hawaii or somewhere else where it's sunshine. You can. But if you're unhappy there, then you move to Hawaii, where you will be elated for a few weeks or a few months, and then you'll be lying on the beach, and you suddenly realize, I'm turning into a beach bum. And mosquitoes are there at night. Shouldn't be happening. And it's too hot. Can't stand this heat anymore.